welcome everyone. It's another episode of Talking with Dr. Donna. I am Dr. Donna. Welcome. It is Thursday at 6 p.m., which means that it is time for your appointment with your doctor. So welcome to another episode of Talking with Dr. Donna. As always, if you have any questions, you can leave it into the chat in the comment section. I'm going to look through the comment section and try to answer your questions live as best I can. So today we are going to talk about the flu vaccine. The flu vaccine. Why should you get the flu vaccine? Anybody out there actually get the flu vaccine? I do. I get it every single year. And I agree. So many of you say, oh, I get a flu vaccine. It's so difficult and I get sick from it. I don't like getting it. And that's true. I think years ago when they first started out giving the flu vaccine, so many of us would take the vaccine and then we would get sick. I haven't found that in the last decade. Okay. So that conversation, I think, is a long overdue conversation to put to rest. The flu vaccine does not make you sick every single year. Yes, and Stacy is agreeing with me. So getting the flu vaccine does not make you sick. So please, we're going to talk today about why I strongly encourage you to get the flu vaccine. So, my mission at Talking with Dr. Donna is to create generational health. And that means that every generation is, for as long as possible, stays together and stays alive, right? And that means starting with you right now, right where you are. What can you do to make sure that you are as healthy as possible so that you can continue to live for generations either in front of you or behind you? All right. So let's talk a little bit first about the flu disease, the virus of the flu. So many of us are wondering, what's going on with the flu? How is it different from the coronavirus? And why are we so excited about the flu and not about the coronavirus? So I'm going to give you some statistics, okay? So I'm going to go off of the flu season from last year because we are just starting to enter the flu season for 2020. We're not there yet. So flu season for 2019, okay? So there were, and we're talking in the United States, 35.5 million cases. So those are known cases. Those are people who we diagnosed with the flu. Those are not the people who got sick, thought that they had the flu, but we never actually got tested. So that means there's probably more than 35.5 million cases of the flu. There were about 34,000 deaths in the United States from the flu last year. All right, now let's talk about coronavirus. Coronavirus, so far to date, we have about 751,000 cases. So 35.5 million cases of flu and about 751,000 cases of coronavirus. So if you compare case to case, there's actually more people who catch the flu than actually catch coronavirus, right? Now let's look at the deaths because that's the good thing about statistics. Statistics can be a little bit misleading. Yes, there are definitely more cases of the flu, but when we look at deaths, 34,200 deaths from flu in 2019, we are up to, and let's look at my data, 192,000 deaths from coronavirus. So while there are more cases of flu, there are more deaths of coronavirus. Okay. So, but both diseases cause a lot of sickness, a lot of hospitalizations, and a lot of death. Okay. So what is the flu? I want to talk to you a little bit about a virus and about how it changes and why every year we always have to go get a flu shot. Why can't we just go off of the flu shot that we got last year? Why do I have to get a flu shot again this year and every single year? And this is why. So someone's going to help me one day with some animation, but for now, you're just going to have little old me. So imagine a ball, okay? Imagine the virus is a ball, okay? So this is the virus. There's little spikes on this ball of the virus. Those spikes are called antigens or proteins. Okay, so what is an antigen or the protein on the spikes of these balls? And I know you have all seen those pictures now of coronavirus with the ball and these little red things sticking out. Those things are the antigens or the proteins. And now, when you have these little spikes, these proteins, the proteins are really what speaks to your body. So you get this virus, it infects the cell, and then your body says, oh, hey, I either have seen that protein before, and if it has seen that protein before, then your body triggers an immune response. And that immune response is what's called antibodies. Get it? Antigens, antibodies. And the antibodies then start to kick into action and they say, I've seen that before. I know that it is not a part of me as my cells, so I'm going to go attack it. That's your body attacking the disease and then hopefully curing you, right? Now, there are some viruses like coronavirus where it has these spikes, these antigens or proteins that are not triggering a immune response because your body has never seen those proteins. And so that's why you can't build an antibody. So sometimes the viruses that we have are closely related to each other. Okay. And how they get closely related to each other is that those little antigens, those spikes that are on the virus, they start to mutate or change over time. That's called an antigen drift. Okay. That means it's changing. Sometimes the viruses actually are very close to each other. And that's why we have sort of multiple types of influenza A, and we have influenza B and multiple types of those. Those are antigen drifts, which means they're in the same family and they're pretty closely related. They're sort of like cousins. And so your body kind of recognizes it and so kind of mounts a bit of an immune response, but not fully because it doesn't quite recognize that member of the family. That's antigen drift. That's why we change the flu vaccine every year, because every year there are different flu viruses that are circulating in the world that have mutated a little bit so that they're a little different from year to year. And so the vaccine has to be adjusted and adapted to these new viruses and these new antigens that are the proteins on these viruses that have drifted and mutated over a year or so. So that's why it's important to get a flu vaccine every year, because every year the flu virus is just a little bit different than the virus was a year prior. So it's really important to get a flu vaccine every year because of that antigen drift. Now, there is something called an antigen shift, and that's a huge mutation. That's a big change. And that usually comes when a virus that usually only infected animals mutates itself so that now it becomes able to infect humans. And then that's an antigen shift. That's a huge, right? That's a big change from the virus where it was. Now it's a completely different virus. And that happened in our last flu pandemic. That was in 2009 when we were introduced to H1N1, or as some of you may recall, we called it the swine flu, because that virus really only infected swines and birds. And then all of a sudden, it mutated, it changed itself to then be able to infect humans. And because our bodies had never seen it before, we had a pandemic, right? So many people infected, so many people sick, because our human bodies had never seen it before. And so our bodies couldn't fight it because it just had nothing. It had no antibodies stored up, didn't recognize it at all. And we had our very first pandemic. Okay. Hi, Sharice. So that's a little bit about antigen shift, antigen drift, a bit about viruses, antigens, and antibodies. Now, you guys are super smart now, right? So you understand why it's important to get a flu vaccine every single year. That's because of this antigen drift, okay? All right. Now, if you have a question, again, write it in the chat. I am kind of monitoring the lines. So if you have any questions, go ahead and type it in and I'll try to answer it. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the flu vaccine itself. So we know that every year the flu vaccine changes, and we know why now. A little bit of this antigen drift, it changes and mutates, right? Now, there's so many different types of flu vaccines, and that is going to, where type of flu vaccine you get is going to depend on where you get the vaccine. So sometimes vaccines, you get them at various places. They offer different types of vaccines. So I want to talk to you a little bit about the various types of vaccines that are available. And depending on where you go, whether you get it from CVS or whether you get it from Kaiser or whether you get it from your doctor at Sutter or whether you get it at work, everybody might have a little different types of vaccine. So there are live vaccines, which means that it's actually a little bit of the flu virus within the vaccine. It's attenuated, which means that it's not going to give you a full-blown flu, but it can give you some flu-like symptoms because they're actually giving you the virus so that your body, again, sees those antigens, creates an immune response, you build up antibodies, and then let's say you actually are out in the community and you get infected with the flu, where your body can immediately start to attack it because it recognizes it as foreign and is ready to pounce on that virus as it enters your body. Okay, so there's a trivalent vaccine, which means there are only 3 types of the flu vaccine. And there's a quadvalent, that's 4 types of vaccine. There's the live, like I just talked about. And then there's a recombinant, which means that they take the vaccine, the live virus, or they take the live virus and then they sort of put extra proteins on it so that it doesn't actually make you sick, but your body recognizes the virus just as if they had given you a live virus. Isn't all of this amazing? I mean, virology, which is the study of viruses, is so incredibly interesting. And is so important for us to keep us all healthy. So, let's talk about what each component of the 4 vaccines are. Okay, so the trivalent vaccine has influenza A and influenza B. So basically now we know from antigen drift and all of the various years of vaccines that we've produced, we know that there's influenza A, and then there's subtypes of influenza A, and there's influenza B and subtypes of influenza B. Most of our tests now, when we test for flu, it tests for influenza A and B. That wasn't always the case because influenza B was not as important in terms of getting us sick. That happened years ago, where we started testing for influenza B as well as influenza A. So if you get the trivalent vaccine, which means that there's 3 different vaccine or 3 different viruses that they're vaccinating against, there is 2 virus of A and 1 of B. Now you might be saying, well, how do I know which one I'm going to get? Again, it really depends on where you get your vaccine. So it's hard for me to say which vaccine you should get because it's so many factors that go into looking at what type of vaccine you're going to get. But know that A and B usually are in all of the vaccines. So how do we know really which viruses we should be protecting ourselves against? Well, that's what all the people do in public health department and the CDC. They look across the world and globally pay attention to all of these viruses and sort of look at, well, which viruses are starting to infect people. And they start out with a set of viruses that they think might possibly come into the United States. And then as the world starts to get infected and the flu virus starts to circulate, they may update those vaccines so that the viruses that are actually out there in the world are now the same viruses that are actually going to be in our vaccine. So that's why the vaccine is not ready in January, right? Because it's looking at what's happening across the world and paying really close attention. So by the time flu season comes around, September or October, then we actually have kind of the most up-to-date viruses that have been infecting people across the world. All right, so the trivalent has influenza A, 2 subtypes of influenza A, and 1 subtype of influenza B. Now, there is the quadvalent vaccine. Now, that quad, 4, means that there's 2 subtypes of influenza A and 2 subtypes of influenza B. There's also the live vaccines. And the live vaccine, as you may recall, there's the intranasal vaccine where it's actually squirts up your nose. That is a live vaccine. So that vaccine is usually a quadrivalent. So it has 2 subtypes of influenza A and 2 subtypes of influenza B. And then you can take it if you don't like shots, right? But again, the flip side is that it's a live vaccine. All right. So there are 2 new vaccines that are out there. So if you're 65 years or older, or if you know someone who's 65 years or older, there's these 2 sort of super vaccines, as you can call it. The regular vaccines, and then they're just a little bit of an attenuation, which means it has kind of more, kind of an adjunct to it for those who are at a higher risk of 65 years or older. So those vaccines are a little different. So here's the point about your vaccine. When you're going to the doctor and you're going to get a flu vaccine, you should ask what type of flu vaccine you're receiving. The other reason you want to ask, besides knowing if you're going to have 1 subtype of B or 2 subtypes of B, is whether or not your vaccine is egg-based. There are some vaccines that are egg-based and some vaccines that are not. Obviously, if you recall, there used to have a kind of give you a screening sheet and says, you know, are you allergic to eggs? Have you ever had a reaction to eggs? Have you ever had an anaphylactic reaction to eggs? Because sometimes we would give them the vaccine even if they were allergic to eggs, but they, you know, didn't have an anaphylactic reaction, which means you didn't have any difficulty breathing. So if you broke out with a really small rash, we might still say, oh, it's okay to go ahead and do the flu vaccine because you have just a little allergy to the egg. So ask these questions. What type of vaccine am I getting from the flu? Does it have the, you know, 2 subtypes of A and 2 subtypes of B? Is it with egg or not with egg? And of course, each type is going to depend on your own particular situation. All right. Who should get a flu vaccine? Well, anybody older than 6 months should get a flu vaccine. Okay. If you have a baby, particularly during this time, I highly recommend that your baby, if it's he or she is greater than 6 months old, get a flu vaccine. I guess the question then is, Dr. Donna, do you recommend getting a flu vaccine? The answer is pretty easy for me and pretty simple, and that is yes. I highly recommend a flu vaccine. Why? For the reason that I talked about at the very beginning. Many millions of cases of people who who get infected with the flu and also become hospitalized. This season, we have an additional virus to contend with, which is the coronavirus. And the 2 viruses are similar in terms of their symptoms. So it's going to be even more important that you at least have some protection against one of those 2 viruses, because in the very beginning, you may not be able to tell the 2 apart. But if you have the flu vaccine, again, that ball and those antigens, those proteins, your body has already seen one of those viruses and is starting to build an antibody response so that when that virus enters your body again, your body is prepared to go to war and start to fight for you to get healthy. So that's why I recommend it. Right now, the activity of flu across the United States is pretty low. So we're not really at a peak flu season. I recommend that you wait to get the flu vaccine. And the reason that I recommend you wait is because we know that the flu vaccine is sort of at its peak and best efficacy for about 3 months. It will definitely last longer, but definitely for those 3 months, we know that it works extremely well. So if you can kind of put off waiting, to get the vaccine until, say, October. Then you have October, November, December sort of coverage. And even though the flu season can extend into January and sometimes February, by that time, the cases are starting to drop off. And so while the flu is still in our community, it's not as so many people having the risk of developing flu. So I recommend waiting until about October. You can check the CDC website, cdc.gov, to see kind of what the flu is sort of looking like, and whether or not it's starting to hit, in the next 2 weeks or in the end of September. If by the end of September, it still looks like the virus hasn't quite made its way to the United States, then I would wait and not do it in the first part of October. I would wait until we start to see a little bit of an uptick of the flu in our community and in the United States to get the flu vaccine. And again, that's because viruses don't have a calendar. They don't keep calendar. They don't say, oh, I'm only supposed to be infecting from September through December. Oh, what am I doing? It's January. I should stop infecting. Viruses do not do that. They come when they come and they leave when they leave. So we are just playing a guessing game by saying, get your flu shot starting in September, because we're guessing based on previous experience and previous flu that it will start to sort of come into our communities around that time. But here we are, kind of early-ish part of September, and we're really not seeing lots of flu cases around the country. So that's why I'm saying I feel pretty comfortable saying let's wait until October. But again, I'm going to keep my eye on the CDC and kind of see what is coming around in our community. And if by the end of September, I'm still really not seeing a lot of flu activity, then me and my family, we're going to postpone getting our flu shot until a little bit later. All right. So that's just my recommendation. Who should get a flu vaccine? Like I said, anybody over the age of 6 months should get a flu vaccine, but particularly if you are in a high risk group. That means those of you older than 50, older than 50, that's me. We're in a high risk group. All right. If you are pregnant or are planning to be pregnant during flu season, you're at a high risk and you should get a flu vaccine. If you're immunocompromised in any way, so if you have a chronic disease, if you have cancer, if you have HIV, if you have sickle cell disease, chronic diseases that cause your immune system to be compromised, you should get a flu shot. If you have cardiovascular disease, heart disease, or pulmonary disease, chronic disease, COPD, asthma, these are high risk categories, and you should definitely get a flu shot. Again, because the flu likes to attack the lungs, and it likes to attack those whose immune systems are not really able to mount that really high antibody response when they see these antigens coming into the body. All right. So again, if you have any information, any questions, go ahead and write it down. Oh, this is really important also. If you are a caregiver, so that means those of us in the healthcare profession, we get a flu shot every year. But if you are caring for somebody who is in a high risk group, so you yourself may not be in a high risk group. You may not be over 50. You may not be immunocompromised. You may not have a cardiovascular pulmonary disease. You're not pregnant. So you're not really in a high risk group, but you care for someone who's in a high risk group, then you should also get a flu shot, because of course, if you get the flu and you pass it on to someone in a high risk group, it could be deadly for them. All right, so I think that's enough information about influenza, about the flu vaccine. I hope that I've given you some information for you to think about. If you've never gotten the flu shot or never wanted to get the flu shot, don't like getting the flu shot, I hope I've given you some information, some things to think about that will give you the decision to get a flu shot this year. My last point, looking at studies for children, and this is for children in particular, children are shown to actually get coronavirus and the flu together. So if there's any group of people that is more inclined to get both diseases, both viruses during this time, it is our children. So it's really, really important to get your children vaccinated with the flu this season, because coronavirus and flu, again, like to run together, particularly in our children. Okay. So again, yes, Stacy, if you live with someone in a high risk group, you care for someone in a high risk group, you definitely should get a flu vaccine. All right. Again, let me know if you have any other questions. This is Talking with Dr. Donna. We are building generational health one person at a time. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you have any other questions, feel free to leave it in the comment section. But for now, continue to wear your mask, continue to social distance, continue to be safe and healthy. God bless you.